It is early morning. You stand in front of the mirror, lift your shirt slightly, and look at the same spot you have been looking at for months. The belly. Not dramatically large, but stubborn, resistant. Unchanged despite the walks, despite cutting back on food, despite everything you have tried. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you are convinced the answer must involve hours of cardio. Running, cycling, something exhausting. But here's what the science actually says. The primary driver of visceral belly fat accumulation is not a lack of movement. It is a hormonal environment inside your body that cardio, on its own, does very little to correct. The fat stored around your abdomen, specifically the deep visceral fat that wraps around your internal organs, is not simply excess energy sitting idle. It is metabolically active tissue, and it responds more directly to hormonal signals than to calories burned during exercise. The hormone most closely linked to visceral fat retention is insulin. When insulin levels remain chronically elevated throughout the day, due to frequent eating, high carbohydrate meals, or large blood glucose swings, the body remains in a fat storage state for extended periods. In this state, regardless of how much you move, the biological conditions for fat release are simply not present. This is the mechanism most people are never told about. Fat cells release stored fat into the bloodstream through a process called lipolysis, but insulin actively suppresses lipolysis. Even modest elevations in insulin are enough to put the brakes on fat breakdown. So the question of losing belly fat is not primarily about burning more calories during a workout. It is about creating enough time in the day when insulin is low enough for lipolysis to actually occur. The method that directly addresses this mechanism is structured eating compression, reducing the window of time during which you eat without necessarily changing what you eat. When food intake is compressed into a shorter daily window, insulin has more hours each day to fall to its baseline, and the body spends more time in a hormonal state that permits fat mobilization. Research into time-restricted eating has shown meaningful reductions in visceral fat in some studies, though results vary based on individual metabolic health, the quality of food consumed, and how consistently the pattern is maintained. It is not a guaranteed outcome, but the biological logic is grounded in well-established insulin physiology. The real-world consequence of ignoring this mechanism is the familiar frustration of doing everything right on the surface. Exercising. Reducing portions, while the hormonal environment underneath remains unchanged because eating is spread across 14 or 15 hours of the day, keeping insulin elevated almost continuously. Cardio burns calories during the session, but it does not restructure the hormonal pattern that governs where and whether fat is stored or released across the other 22 hours. The mental shift this requires is moving away from the idea that belly fat is purely an energy balance problem and toward understanding it as a hormonal regulation problem. Once that shift happens, the levers that actually matter become clearer: meal timing, carbohydrate quality, and giving the body consistent daily windows of low insulin. These are not replacements for healthy eating or physical activity. They are the layer beneath both that most approaches never address. There is no single method that works identically for every person. Metabolism, age, sleep quality, and stress all interact with how the body manages fat. But understanding that visceral fat responds to hormonal conditions rather than just calorie expenditure changes what questions you ask and what changes you actually consider making. The answer was always less about running harder and more about understanding what your biology was waiting for.